I'd like to welcome everybody to our Entuity Tech Talk on the new multi-tenancy enhancements. I'm John Diamond and I'm the product manager at Entuity in the United States, and I'm also here today with my colleague Pete Barth, who is a systems engineer at Entuity. We are going to be your hosts for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. Tech Talks, as most of you know, are designed for our customers and technical members of our authorized partner community. These sessions are recorded and are available on demand from the Entuity YouTube Center. They're a good resource for learning about the product or reviewing features you may be interested in implementing. Just a few housekeeping items before we get into today's content. The call is on mute mode to eliminate any outside noise. Feel free to ask any questions at any time via the chat panel. We will have time at the end to take questions. I'll make sure of that. And so if you post them, we'll get to them. So let's get started. Today, we will be using the recently released Entuity 16.5 version of the product to demonstrate some of the key multi-tenancy enhancement features. I just wanted to take a few moments to set the scene as to where these new enhancements fit within the overall picture of multi-tenancy. Entuity has had multi-tenancy capability for many releases, and it basically allows via the permissioning at the user group level, which is inherited by all of the users who are members of those user groups, to be permitted or denied access to the contents of views and also access to various different tools within the system, which means that if you've got an Entuity server, or in fact a group of servers operating together, and they are monitoring the networks belonging to multiple different organizations, there might be different departments within the same organization, or there might be entirely different companies, as would be the case for a managed service provider, then it's possible to have individual users only being given visibility to one or a subset of those portions of the overall monitored network. What we've done in the 16.5 release is extended the flexibility and usefulness of this capability by allowing an individual Entuity server to be able to manage devices that are residing on networks that have overlapping IP addresses, which means you might end up with two or more devices with the very same IP address, but they belong to different networks, which in the case of an MSP would mean they belong to different customers. But we've now provided a way through a single server of allowing those devices, even though they've got the same IP addresses, to be uniquely addressed. We do that in order that you can reduce the number of Entuity servers that are needed to manage such an environment, possibly even down to a single server, if the number of devices in total across all of the managed networks doesn't exceed the capability of that server. If it does, then you can still use multiple servers, but you can still dramatically drop the number of servers that you would otherwise need, particularly if you have networks that have very few devices that need managing, but those networks do overlap with each other in terms of IP addresses. This is particularly the case where you've got a managed service provider with multiple relatively small customers. Instead of having to allocate separate Entuity servers, even if they're on virtual servers, for each individual customer, there is an overhead involved in that. There is an expense in terms of licensing at the operating system level under some occasions, and that can be reduced if you now use this new technique. The technique involves a concept that Entuity is calling zones. Now, Entuity is using that term to refer to individual networks that would otherwise conflict with each other because of their use of the same IP address ranges. Pete's going to go into a great deal of detail in a moment about the individual zones and how they are used to control the addressing and naming of the devices within them. And one last point here on the topic of zones. If you don't need to accommodate overlapping IP addresses, you simply ignore them. Zones don't have to be used. By default, everything is in a special zone called none. And if you don't need to use this capability to handle overlapping IP addresses, you just leave it alone. Quick point on the fact that I've talked about MSPs being able to take advantage of it. You also have situations on occasions where an enterprise will merge or take over another enterprise, and those previously individual companies may have used overlapping IP addresses. They may have used the same IP address ranges. That's the sort of situation where this could also become useful. And you also have organizations and enterprises, possibly particularly in the area of retail customers, where you would have a large number of individual retail establishments, shops, that might be organized with what you might call a cookie-cutter style network deployment, which means that they would also use exactly the same IP addresses as each other. And this would accommodate that so that they could be managed from a central server and still accommodate the fact that they've got overlapping IP addresses. And just in case anybody is wondering, the approach that Entuity has taken does not use network address translation. There is no NAT involved in this. The use of network address translation when you are performing network management adds an enormous amount of complexity and difficulty when it comes to managing it in a production environment, and we are not using that technique. On that topic, let me hand over to Pete, and he will tell you exactly what we are doing.
Thanks, JD, and welcome everybody. Let me just share out my screen, and we'll get started. All right, so the first thing that I'd like to talk about goes back to what JD referenced. In a case where you may be currently using the multi-server configuration to connect multiple customers together into a consolidation server environment, you may have an environment similar to what I'm showing you on the screen. This is very simple, but in the case I've got a central server that's monitoring a number of devices. I've got another remote server that is sitting halfway around the world. And to be honest, the only reason I have this server out there is because I've got some addresses in my local environment and some addresses in my remote environment that share the same IP space. So I've got overlapping IPs. With 16.5, the opportunity that I've got then is to consolidate these into one platform. So I'll show you how to do that, and the first step that I'm going to take is to actually get rid of my multi-server configuration, because what I'm going to do is show you how I've built everything to be monitored off of the Champlin server here. So let's go ahead and just delete this remote server configuration. And I'm back to one server. Now, the first step that I would need to do in order to leverage zones is to look at the zones themselves. I'd actually have to create a zone. So the way that I would do this is from the inventory zone, whoops, if I hit the right button, zone administration page right here, it would bring me up to this menu. At the beginning, you would see no zones defined, and you just hit the add button. Let me show you an example of one of the zones that I've got already defined. Pretty straightforward. The zone's got a zone name and a description. The key to a zone definition is the IP interface that is going to be bound to that zone. Now, let's talk a little bit about this. In my case, I've got a IPv4 interface, 172.16.2.141 that is actually a named interface and configured interface on the Entuity server. If I take a look at that and I did an IP config, you can see that I've got an Ethernet adapter bound with this address. So the key with a zone is on the Entuity server, you'll want to have a separate interface. It can be a sub-interface, it can be another network card, but it has to be a named interface with an IP address that you can actually bind the zone to. Behind the scenes, in my case, behind the scenes, the routing for how do I get to the devices that I'm going to manage in London from this interface is all done behind the scenes. So it's not something that I have to configure within Entuity. It's something that from a networking standpoint, this address knows how to get to the devices that live in this area. And there's many ways to do that, but it's important to just remember that there isn't anything on the Entuity side that you have to configure other than making sure that you've got an IP address that you can bind a zone to. And then make sure that the proper routing is done behind the scenes to say, 2.141 knows how to get to these addresses. So once I have the interface specified here, and again, I can use a v4 or a v6 interface, I can look at things like name resolution. So how do I name the devices that are being monitored? I'm going to pick up an IP address. What do I want to call that device? If a customer is using their own DNS servers and you'd like to leverage the host name definitions that are in their DNS, you can actually add their DNS servers in here too as part of the zone definition. So when I'm talking to a DNS server, it's going to leverage the interface that my zone is configured to. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is actually using localhost file. Now, traditionally, the host file on a server is going to be located in a Linux environment in etc hosts, in a Windows environment, down to the point where it's also etc hosts, and you would have a host file. In this scenario where you're leveraging a zone, you actually have the ability to create multiple host files on the Entuity server. They would live in the Entuity home directory, and inside there it would be in the etc directory, and there's a directory for zones as well. So you can actually create multiple host files and store them on the Entuity server and then just tie that host file to the zone definition as well. So I've actually got another zone in Texas that is leveraging a host file in that manner. So you have a couple ways to do it. You can leverage the DNS or you can use specific host files. So the other thing that I'd mention here too is when you're looking at naming devices, you can certainly use the standard display name conventions that are available. You can, using a system name or an IP address or a fully qualified or short DNS name or custom name. Those are all certainly available as you bring devices under management. If you would like to put a prefix based on the zone in front of that device display name, you can do that here as well. So in the zone definition, I've actually created a prefix just called UK and a dash. So every device that I've got is going to be prefixed with UK dash, and you'll see that as we go through the demo. So again, it's very straightforward to set up a zone. You can see the details of the zone here. You can also, you can see the details of, you can drill into the zones. You can have certainly many zones and do the administration from this area. Once I've got the zone set up, the next step is going to be adding devices. So if I go under the device administration and I take a look at the devices that I've got, you see that I've got some devices here, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But you can certainly leverage the web-based discovery methods for the devices that you'd like to add. So in my case here, you see that I've got zone awareness for auto-discovery. If I set up my included addresses, I can set all the details up appropriately, and I can say all of these devices need to be tied to one of my specific zones. So I've got my London zone defined here. If I run auto-discovery over this and add those devices, they're going to be bound to that zone. Very straightforward to do that as well. If you're using an import file, there is additional detail included in the seed files if you were going to import devices from a file that would allow you to define the zone in the seed file as well. And finally, if you're just doing an individual add for a device, that menu is also zone aware, so you can choose the zone that you want. Now, notice here that we've got a zone called none. That's important to know because in the case where you have an Entuity server that is monitoring devices and you would now like to make that server zone aware and add zones to it, one of the things that you'll see for the devices that are being monitored is they'll be assigned by default to a zone called none. So all the devices that are existing on that server will be tied to that zone. One of the things that you'll want to remember is if you are adding zones, and again, you don't need to use zones unless you have that overlapping IP address issue. But if you are creating zones, you'll want to move any of the devices from the zone none into a properly named zone. Just as a best practice, having multiple zones is good, but using the none zone is something that you'll want to stay away from. Now it's really easy because if I have these devices and they are in the zone called none, I can certainly shift click, all these, go into the modify button and change the zone from none to the proper zone, and I can do that right on the fly. So very easy. Now, as I add devices, there's some things that our customers run into as they're adding devices in general, and that one of those things is I add a device and it didn't add. So some of the troubleshooting utilities that we've got are also now zone aware. So in the case where I've got a device it didn't add, one of the things that I would normally do is ping the device just to make sure that it's there. Now, in general, if I'm pinging a device from the Entuity server and I just say ping to an IP address, it's going to use the default interface on my server. Ping allows you to specify a source address. So if I want to ping a device using a source address, this is the address that is defined in my zone, I can actually do that here, and the ping is actually going to route properly out that into the customer location. So this is something to be aware of when you're troubleshooting a device. If you need to ping it, make sure to use this. The second utility that many of our customers use, and certainly in a case where a device is added and either you can't connect to it because you may have a firewall rule blocking SNMP access or something like that, or the device may not be certified and you need to get an SNMP dump to our support group. SNMP dump from the Entuity libtools directory also is zone aware. So SNMP dump, again, in its default state, is going to use your default address on the Entuity server. If you need to dump a device that is living in one of your zones, use the client adder parameter here with the address for your zone, and then all the rest of the parameters that you would normally use with SNMP dump. So again, these are just two of the utilities that are very commonly used when you're troubleshooting things. They are now zone aware as well. In the case where you accidentally add a device and you added the device into the wrong zone. So it could be that, when you did an add from the menu here, you picked the wrong zone. Again, it's very easy, even though that device failed, go in and modify that, change the zone from the modify button here. Once that's done, select the device or multiple devices and hit the retry button. One of the features that's new in 16.5 is a modification to this retry button, which will then go and just look at only the failed devices and try to add them back into the system. So I've corrected the configuration for that device. I'm going to retry that. The system is only going to retry the devices that have failed. So once I have devices added, and again, here you see I've got the prefix on devices that I've got in the UK. I'm using multiple display methods where I'm using the system name here, and I'm using just an IP address with a prefix. So you can very much customize what these devices are going to display as. But once I have them added, I take a look at the Explorer menu. And if I take a look at all the objects that I'm monitoring, you see that I've got all the devices here. One of the things that you'll want to do, and what our customers normally do, is look at views. So the views that I've got are going to include, any view-based rationale that your organization has. Views by location, views by device type, views by IP address range. Views can now be built leveraging the zone that the devices are in. So what I've done here is I've actually created a hierarchy where the technology by zone view includes a couple subzones or subviews. You see all the devices that I've got here. You can see that I've got devices that are in multiple zones. If I take a look at the London view, I'm actually looking just at the devices that are in that zone. The way that I did that is using the content filters. Content filters are now zone aware. If I take a look at the content filter that I have in place and take a look at some of the rules, let's just edit one of the rules. You'll see that we've got a new zone parameter here with a drop-down that allows you to select the specific zones that you want. Very straightforward. One thing to note is if you are adding zones to an Entuity server that doesn't have zones to begin with, as you've probably already got views built. If those views need to be zone aware, then what you'll want to do is go into the existing content filters and make the modification to your rules to include this. So by default, I think this would be source equals device and zone equals all. So if the view needs to be zone aware after you've made changes to the Entuity server to configure zones into it, you'll want to come in and make changes to the content filter itself. So content filters are zone aware. Also, if you're using the RESTful API to populate and or build views and build content filters, which is new in 16.5, that is also zone aware. So I've got a view, I've got a couple of subviews, I've got my devices set up appropriately. I'm all set. The next thing that I would want to look at is events. So how am I handling the events, and do my events need to leverage or have some distinction between zones? Do I have differences in my EMS rules for London or Texas? And there's some things that you can do with the EMS because the EMS is also zone aware. If I take a look at the London view here, and let's just take a look at all the events that are coming in. Let's see what we have since this is a live network. One of the things that you'll notice is in the source, I've got my prefix, which can be a customer-specific prefix. But I've also got in the details, I've added some bits into the rules for the EMS that is prepending the name of the zone in front of all the details for that specific incident. Let's take a look at how I did this. If I go into the event management system and I take a look at the rules, in my initial filtering group, I've actually got a rule that is adding the zone name to the details. And this is very straightforward. I've made a test because I want to do this just for some of my customers. So I've got a test that says, only for the devices that are in the London zone or the London view, I'm going to make a change. And the change that I'm going to make is to modify the reason field. Now the reason field is equivalent to the details column in the event management system. What I'm doing here is I'm prepending the zone name, just using concatenation, putting a separator in it, to the existing reason field. So the details field here is called reason, and I'm just prepending it. Once I've made the change, I've deployed the project, and that allows me to see all those additional details. Now this can be really helpful, especially if you're if you're wanting to forward events to a ticketing system or a third party for event integration. Something like BMC's True Site Operations Management would be a perfect example for this. Is I could include very easily customer identification information into some of the existing parameters and attributes that are being forwarded over. Now I can take this a step further, so let me actually show you the script that is part of the action. So the BMC Event Manager allows me to create an action that is really the base for forwarding events and or incidents over to TrueSite Operations Management. If I scroll down this action, one of the things that you'll notice is the definitions of, here we go, the definitions of the parameters that get sent over. So, the name of the device, severity, information about the event itself. And these are all mapped to in BMC terms, a slot value for TrueSite. One of the things that I can do here is just add another value. I can add another slot value, call it whatever I need to, and add the source zone name into that. So I can now send the zone as part of the event in as an individual attribute. Now, if you do this, make sure that on the TrueSite side, you'll need to define that slot as well. So this is something that you'll need to configure on both ends, but it's actually very straightforward to augment the Groovy script for forwarding incident information over to the individual event managers. So that's one step that you could take it. You could actually take it one step further and augment the Entuity system to include a separate attribute for the individual zone. So in my first example, I just pre-appended the zone into the details field. In this example, I'm actually adding the zone information as a enriched attribute into Entuity. So I've actually created an attribute called customer zone, and I'm using the zone name to populate it. When I go back to the event management system, because I've created a custom attribute, I can go in and configure the event viewer, and I'll see that as a hidden column. All I got to do is take this, we'll move it up, put it right next to the source name, hit OK, and I'm now populating the zone. So I've got customer-specific information being highlighted as part of any of the events. So I know which customers these are for, especially if I'm looking at something like the My Network view where I'm focusing on all of my customers. I can easily see who the individual incidents or events are for. Now I can do this as a rule if I'm looking at events, and I can do this as a trigger if I'm looking specifically at incidents. And I won't go into the details of that, but you can leverage zones and these additional attributes for either one. The last thing that I'd like to show is when we look at reports. Now, reports are a very important part of Entuity and the functionality that we deliver. You would think that you'd have to do something special for zones when it comes to reporting, but really you don't, because you'll leverage zone knowledge as you define views, and as you run reports, reports will run over a view and leverage, you'll be reporting information about the contents of that view. So if I want to run a report over the London, D.C. view, I'm actually leveraging that zone because I've defined the devices properly. One of the things that you can do, though, is use a zone as a attribute at the device level in a custom report. So if you're building a custom report, and if I take a look at just the devices here, let's go into the Explore menu, just to look at a device, you'll see that I have an attribute, a standard attribute that is a zone. So for every device, we know what zone it's in. You can very easily drag that into your Dropbox and use that as an attribute in a custom report. So this is just a simple inventory report showing me, I'm going to run this over all my servers, all my devices, and we can just take a look at a preview of what this is. But it's very easy for me to include the zone information, so my customer information, and information about those individual devices. I think that covers it. JD, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete. I think you've covered every aspect that we were hoping to share today. Just to go back to the overall mission here, the driving force behind the introduction of zone support within Entuity is to allow um, systems that need to monitor multiple networks that have overlapping IP addresses to avoid having to deploy individual servers to monitor each one of those networks. You can still do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. However, if you don't want to do that, and you want to consolidate on one or a few servers that will handle multiple of these separate networks on individual servers, then you can do that now by taking advantage of the support for zones. We will disambiguate between the same IP addresses used on different networks by virtue of the zones. Also worth noting that incoming packets that are unsolicited, containing things like traps, syslog events, and flow packets, will also be identified by zone because we know which interface they came in on, which means that we know exactly which network they came from, so there is no ambiguity as to which device they belong to. Okay, Pat, do we have any questions?
Yes, JD, we have a couple.
Okay, good.
And the first one is, in context with overlapping IP addresses, if we assign each zone as a separate NIC, then do you mean each zone is going to have a separate routing table, something like VRF?
Okay, so assigning a separate NIC network interface to each of the zones is a valid way to work. The routing itself, how that network interface is connected to the individual network is up to you in how you configure your systems and your hosting network to get that there. The main thing is that the operating system on the hosting server is not going to be sending traffic down that interface of its own accord. You won't have the system set to route directly from the operating system. All of the routing of traffic down that interface is going to be done by Entuity. It will know when it needs to talk to that zone by virtue of the zone configuration, and it will directly send the traffic down that interface which has been identified by an IP address. As for how that interface connects to the target network, that is up to you. If there's any routing involved in that, then that's up to you to configure. But within the operating system itself is not going to be directly forwarding that. It's going to be Entuity talking directly to that interface. I hope that clarifies the situation there. Pat, do we have another question?
Yep. And the last question is, once I consolidate my servers, what do I do with my previous device history?
Oh, that's a good one. In fact, the good news is we are working on delivering a command line utility which will solve that issue. The utility is called Stream Migration, and it will be included in the patch 1 for Entuity 16.5 that is due to be released at the end of the first quarter next year. So that's the end of March. It is currently undergoing beta trials. If there is any feeling that you have that you would need or you want to get your hands on that ahead of it formally being released, if you contact our support team and discuss it with them, then they may be able to arrange for early access to it. Once again, the name is Stream Migration. The idea is that it will allow you to write to one or more files containing the data that is extracted representing the history of multiple devices on one server, and then that collection of files can then be imported into another server to backfill the history of those same devices that would have recently been discovered on that server. So for the devices that you want to move, you would rediscover them on the target server, the server that you want to set up the new monitoring on. And once they've been discovered, then you would use this utility to backfill the history data into them. It is heavily configurable. There's a configuration file that you set up to describe how it's going to work, and then it will export the data and then allow you to import the data. So the answer is yes, we've got you covered, and that, by the way, would be useful even if you don't have overlapping IP addresses. If you simply want to rebalance the multi-server configuration and take devices from one server and move the responsibility for managing them to another, then you would be able to use this same utility to move the history that has been gathered for those devices from one server to another. Pat, do we have any other questions coming in?
Yes, actually we have an add-on from the very first question, and it is, and can we assign sub-interfaces or logical interfaces to zone instead of physical interfaces?
The answer is absolutely yes. Any form of network interface, whatever it is, it might even be a tunnel, maybe a VPN tunnel, so it's a soft interface, that type of interface, anything that will allow you to funnel the traffic out to the target network, and it has an IP address at the server end, v4 or IPv6, doesn't matter which, then we will be able to accommodate that. So it's simply a matter of identifying the mechanism by which the traffic will be transported between the Entuity server and the target network. So it looks like that's it for the questions. We'll be sending you a video link of today's presentation for your use. If you have any questions about today's content, be sure to contact your Entuity systems engineer. One last thing before we close today's session. From everyone here at Entuity, we wish you the happiest of holidays. It is during this season we remember that our relationship is a valued one, and we sincerely appreciate your loyalty. And here's to 2017, that it will be a year of progress and peace. Thanks for attending today, and we'll see you in the new year.